All right, well, guys, welcome back to Thriller Podcast. And for tonight, we are the Mitch Rapp Podcast again. And I think I can safely say this might be the first time any author has done an interview with a real character in their books who also happens to be a massive super fan. We not only have the real Chris Henrik with us tonight, one of the biggest Mitch Rapp fans in the universe, but we have the reason that Mitch Rapp lives, Don Bentley. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
So how's everything going? How's coming off this end of the trilogy?
So far, so good. Tomorrow, so the way it works is the book comes out on Tuesday, and then you find out usually the following Wednesday how it placed on the New York Times list. So that is what I am anxiously awaiting. And but it was super fun. We do I did, the Vince, which maybe is also the Mitch book stop tour, where I got to see Chris and hang out, and then go to Poison Pen. But was kind of fun. We always do a book launch here in my hometown, north of us in Georgetown, and this was the first time that there were more people I didn't know there than just friends and stuff. And so there were a ton of Mitch Rapp fans. So it's been super cool.
Yeah, no, I think it's been, we didn't get a chance to talk to you last time around, but, we loved the last book. And, I think, you've taken this series by the reins, and, it's been great. And, I guess for our listeners, you probably hashed this out a bunch of times, but if you wouldn't mind just going into what was it like, doing the first book and then now deciding to do the second book and then getting the chance to finish that trilogy that we've all, super fans want that done. Can you just tell us, a little bit of both of those things?
Yeah. So it was super heavy to do the first book just from the standpoint of I was a fan long before I was even a writer, and certainly ever had the idea that I'd get to write in the universe that Vince created. And I just wanted to make sure that the first book I did was a worthy entry into that universe. And so it seemed to be received pretty well, but then I think I made it, gave myself another bar that was hard to get over, from the standpoint of every Mitch Rapp fan wants to know what happened to Greta and wants to know how that trilogy ended and all of the cool stuff that Vince hinted at in American Assassin and Kill Shot, what happened to that. And so my editor, who was also Vince's editor, Emily Bessler, has always been super supportive. And she was just like, tell whatever story jazzes you. Tell whatever story that fires you up and gets you excited to sit down and write. And so I said, I want to tell this story. And I didn't know if she would hesitate or anything like that. And she said, great, write it. And I'm like, man, now I got to write it. And so there's, as you all know, women who love Mitch Rapp don't tend to fare well. And so I had to figure out what happened to Greta, but then have what happened to Greta in a way that was both inevitable, because we all know that she's never mentioned again, but also surprising, which I think are also the two components of any good thriller novel. You always want to look back on it and say, well, of course that's what happened. But when it was happening, you don't want to be able to guess kind of how it's going to go. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that and thinking what could have happened, what would have been so traumatic is maybe the wrong word, but what would have been so divisive? Because when you read American Assassin and Kill Shot, it seems very much that they are about to go right off into the sunset together. That at the, in Kill Shot, he actually tells her he loves her, and is making this big step that he hadn't since his first girlfriend. When Vince is in Mitch's head, Mitch is saying things like, there have been other women, and it certainly wasn't that I became a monk after Mary died, but the idea that this one meant something special to him, but then we never hear about her again. And so that was kind of a tricky thing to try and navigate, for sure.
Yeah, I believe that. And it's also tricky because wrapped up in the Mitch and Greta relationship, Stan Hurley and Thomas Stansfield have certain feelings, some very strong feelings on that in Kill Shot and American Assassin. So what was it like digging up those two old codgers and, one old codger and one old spy master, digging them up and really getting to tell their story? Because I could have spent I loved how much time we did spend with them. I could take a whole novel for each of them, or a whole trilogy for each of them.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. I think it's Kill Shot. There's a section where Mitch is thinking about what would happen to him if Greta's grandfather ever figures out that he's dating Greta, and really alludes to the fact that the guy has so much pull that potentially Mitch could be on the run for the rest of his life, and he could have guys chasing him that want to express her grandfather's displeasure in very visceral terms. And so I had kind of that. I thought about that for a while and what that could look like. And then what was also very interesting is you see across the trilogy kind of this arc of Stan Hurley and how he goes from an American assassin, he hates Mitch and does the best that he can to wash him out, even though, and so you would think at the end of American Assassin, when Mitch saves his life, that everything would be great between them, but it isn't. And so you see Kill Shot almost as if it stands attempt to say, hey, I told you guys so. I told you this guy was reckless. I told you he was going to screw this up. And so Vince just does this masterful job, rather than just reconciling them, he makes it believable that it's worse, even though at that point Stan already owes his life to Mitch. And then you fast forward, it ends in that where there's a little bit where Stan's like, okay, I screwed this up. And, at the end of Kill Shot, he and Mitch seem like they're in a decent place, but I would call it more of a ceasefire than it is, they're buddies or anything like that. But the other thing that Vince did so well in that book is alluded to how many bridges Stan burned with Irene, with Stanfield. And so as I was writing Denied Access, I was really thinking, what would he have to do to build that back? And how hard would it be for Stan to eat crow, suck it down, be humble, and trying as much as Stan Hurley can be humble to be one of the team. And so you see that a lot in Denied Access. The other character you see quite a bit is Thomas Stanfield. And so I'm a little bit, or maybe quite a bit, older than you guys. And so I remember when the Berlin Wall came down. I remember when during the Clinton administration, we were talking about the peace dividend from the military perspective. And then certainly even with the CIA, where they're like, hey, you guys missed, you guys missed the Berlin Wall coming down. You missed the Soviet coup against Gorbachev. You missed that the Soviet Union was actually going to crumble. What do we even need a CIA for anymore? This whole time we've been working against the Russians. The Russians or the Soviets are gone now. The Russians are going to be our friends. Why do we even need that? And so I thought the other thing that Vince did at the end of Kill Shot is he has this crazy international incident, right, where Mitch goes in and he kills a member of the French DGSE. He kills, another high-ranking, I believe it's Saudi official. He kills who is the heir apparent of the CIA director, and then you never know what happens to any of that. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to play that out and say, what kind of trouble is Thomas Stanfield going to have as he tries to become the CIA director? And then also, Vince alluded to the fact that Stanfield was in the OSS, and then in another rap book in the title escapes me right now, he goes into a little more detail of what Stanfield did, but it's just narration. It's just like he did this, he did this, he did this. And so when I was doing research for this, I thought, man, it would be really, really fun to show Stanfield as a young operative in the OSS. And so most folks know about what's called Operation Paperclip at the end of World War II, where the U.S. Was scooping up Nazi scientists, primarily Nazi rocket scientists. And the Soviets had their own counterpart, but they were also interested in a different kind of scientist, specifically scientists who were working on the atom bomb for the Nazis. And so they had one operation that was in charge of rounding up those scientists. They had another operation that was in charge of getting the material they needed in order to fabricate a nuclear bomb. And so one of those things is something called uranium oxide that the Nazis had a stash of that the Soviets were desperately trying to find. And so what was neat is during that time period in the OSS itself, there was some division between the ranks of how to look at the Soviets going forward. So they were sort of our notional allies in World War II, I would argue more by because they didn't have any other choice than because they chose it, right? Once Hitler invaded Russia, they're like, oh, maybe we made a mistake here. And so there were elements of the OSS that said, hey, these guys are our friends now. We shouldn't run operations against them. And then there were elements that were more realistic in nature and said, this is going to be the next threat. Stalin is basically Hitler with, in a different country and maybe a slightly different ideology. And so I thought, like, where would Thomas Stanfield come down in that debate? And then was there a way to show that? And so that was really, really fun, kind of writing that opening scene of showing him in World War II as a young OSS officer. And then it sets up this whole arc for the book where you basically have this 50-year struggle between Thomas Stanfield and a man that becomes his counterpart in the KGB, who we first meet during that encounter, and they don't realize it yet. And so that was a ton of fun. And then as part of that, I also got to show Stan Hurley in a flashback too, kind of working on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall. And that was another thing that I took from Vince, because he, again, in one of the books had this aside that one time the KGB sent a couple officers off after Hurley and their bodies were floating in the river the next day. And Hurley, being Hurley, responds by breaking in the guy's office and stealing all his files. And I thought, I wonder what could have been in those files. And maybe that was something that I could use. And so I think what you see with Denied Access, hopefully, the whole time is that it's very much a new story, but it is very much based on a lot of hanging chads, I guess, for lack of a better term, that Vince left in his books. And it was super fun to try and pull those together.
No, you have like every fan's dream of like, as you're reading a book, you're like, oh, I want to hear about that. And then as soon as we started and the opening chapter was with Stansfield in that, I was like, oh, we're on for a good ride. Like, this is going to be awesome.
And then also it does transition, as you mentioned, to an espionage book, a spies book. Feel like you're reading some Le Carre level stuff, and we're getting to do that in the Mitch Rapp universe and playing this historical sandbox. You really gave yourself a tall task, and it seems like the hours of research, not only in Vince's book, but the historical research, it paid off in this book. So what was it like trying to transition to something new, to an espionage thriller, when maybe I haven't seen much of that in the Matt Drake series, for example? He's always kicking ass and taking names. So Mitch Rapp has that element of what Matt Drake does. But what about the espionage stuff? Was that another level you had to go to?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you would ask most of us who write in this genre, who write really more military, political thrillers, military thrillers, we all will tell you we write espionage novels, because it's kind of like a commercial fiction writer saying, well, I really write literary stuff. And most of us don't. The friend of mine who does, that's a phenomenal writer, is a guy named David McCluskey, whose first book, Damascus Station, is one of the best in the genre. His new one, The Persian, just came out, and that's fantastic too. And so I called him up because I had the idea. I think all of Vince's books dealt with the Islamic terrorist threat. I don't think any of them dealt with, at least from a Cold War perspective, kind of this. And so I had that idea of being able to slide it in there, specifically because around that time period, Vince was, he played kind of fast and loose with a lot of the facts from the standpoint of trying to pinpoint exactly the year that it took place. Kyle and I kind of talk back and forth about what it means. And so one of the things off the top of my head is that when the KGB dissolved, it eventually became two different services, the FSR and the FSB. But for a time period, there was another service called the FSK that became the FSB, the kind of the MI5 version, or the counterintelligence half of the KGB. And Vince mentions all three of those in his books as if they're all happening at the same time. And so you can know kind of about when it is, but not exactly the year. And so as I was looking at it and realized, hey, this is the fall of the Soviet Union, it is the Soviet coup has just happened, the KGB, I was pretty certain based on clues that I was digging up in the book that had already happened because the KGB splitting, because he had talked about that a little bit. And so I thought, man, wouldn't that be really fun to write this as a Cold War book? Because there were some very interesting things happening in the world of the intelligence at this time. And so back a couple years earlier in 1986, I believe it is, they had something that was called the Year of the Spy. And it was christened that by Time magazine because there had been so many American spies that had been arrested. The Russians had so heavily penetrated both the armed forces, the intelligence services and stuff, that they were arresting Americans left and right. And then in conjunction with that, during that time, but then certainly in the early 90s, there were this rash of Soviet agents, so Russians recruited by the CIA to spy on their behalf, who kept getting rolled up, and nobody could figure out why it was happening or how it was happening. And the CIA and FBI both blamed each other, as they're wont to do. And so the spoiler alert is that it was both of their faults, because the CIA had a mole named Aldrich Ames, and the FBI had a special agent named Robert Hansen. And both of these men, to protect themselves, were giving the Soviets anyone who might know who they were, and every single agent who was working on the Americans' behalf. And so you had this crazy thing where the CIA was kind of afraid of their own shadow at that point. And so I called up David McCluskey to ask him about it, because in addition to being a fantastic writer, he's also a former CIA officer. And he recommended a book called The Main Enemy that a guy named Milt Bearden wrote, and co-wrote rather. And Milt was a CIA officer. He was a case officer. He was head of the Near East Division. He was actually, during the Soviet invasion into Afghanistan, he was running covert operations with the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And so I read the book and I told David, and I'm like, man, that was phenomenal. I wish I could talk to that guy. And David said, well, he lives in Austin, right? And so David brokered the introduction, and Milt's in his 80s now. And he said, why don't you come down to my office? And it was like walking into, like a set for Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or something. Like on one wall, there's this picture of Milt briefing President Reagan. And then another one is him with his arm around the final director of the KGB and just an incredible guy. And so he started relaying kind of the veracity that became the backbone of the book from the standpoint of, he tells this really cool story. And I can't remember if he said it in the book or just to me or both, but he went over to Moscow Station to try and help motivate them and get them back into what they called the sticks and bricks, back out running agents and doing what they're supposed to. And so he's sitting with the Moscow chief of station in what's called the Yellow Submarine, which is the most secure spot. It's what we call those now SCIFs, and it's the secure spot inside the CIA annex, which is inside the embassy. And there's no way anybody in the world could listen to him. It's the most secure spot in Russia, maybe one of the most secure spots in the world. And the CIA chief of station looks at Milt and he says, sometimes I think they can hear us even here. And Milt took that away and he's like, oh my gosh, the Russians have gotten so far into these officers' heads that the CIA had convinced itself that the Soviets or Russians had invented a new form of technology that they were using to surveil them, because they kept losing so many assets. And I thought that would be great. And if there is somebody that Thomas Stanfield is going to send over to Moscow Station to kick butt and give them a little bit of backbone, who would that be? And so that was where I got to bring Irene into this.
Nice.
That's amazing. You get to write Irene in a situation like that based on a real old spy master. So
yeah,
what an amazing resource to lean on, and it reminds me of Vince. We didn't know this directly when I was reading the books, but later on we got to talk to Rob Richer, who was at the time either chief of the Near East division or somewhere high up working that desk. And he was Vince's main contact at the CIA.
Oh, wow.
And so there's a character, Rob Ridley, which is loosely based on Rob Richer, and sounds like you're just recreating in your own way, in your own storytelling universe, all these same kind of notes, that Vince did with the love he put into the series, reaching out to David, reaching out to Milt. It's just amazing that you get that so right in this book. And you seem to love this time period. I mean, your whole explanation of the really FSB fun. And the FS, I could spend hours. It's like you're lecturing it for a Cold War history class. Please keep going. But does that mean you might want to write more and tell more stories in this time period?
See, I knew you guys were going to do that. I knew you were going to try and do that. So what I had told Chris, even though I didn't know she was going to be here, is that when we were together, and I owe Chris kind of an inside bit that I will share with you guys now too. So I'm about 44,000 words into the book, and I never talk about works in progress. I don't ever share anything, but Chris told me that when we talked, I should. And so because Chris said so, what I will tell you is that in the book that I'm working on right now, Mitch Rapp is a character. So that is what I can reveal to you at this point.
Mitch Rapp lives.
But one of the other super, before we jump off that topic, super interesting things. So the title of the book, Denied Access, is also actually a takeoff of the words denied area. And so denied area is how the CIA classified Moscow itself, because the counter surveillance officers from the KGB were so thick, it was really, really hard to get any work done. And they would be able to finger, normally because Moscow Station was such an important CIA station, only the more senior CIA officers would go there to run assets. And so the KGB was good enough that they realized were able to track who the CIA officers were and knew most of the time as they landed in country, even though they were under diplomatic cover or whatever cover they're using, these are CIA officers rather than State Department officials or whatever. So the CIA, to combat that, decided they had to take this gamble. And so what they did was took a whole bunch of fresh, young case officers who had never been anywhere, who had just graduated the farm, and they developed this curriculum in Washington, D.C. to mimic the streets of Moscow and the kind of surveillance they were going to be under, and took these green case officers, ran them through the school, and I can't remember what the school was called, and then sent them to Moscow as brand new agents on their first tour, hoping that the KGB officers wouldn't realize who they were and wouldn't be able to track them. And sometimes they train the spouses as well. And again, to be very clear, the spouses were never, case officers were never meant to be doing brush passes and such. But there was the expectation that some of the cover is that you're there with your family. And so maybe you go on this trip somewhere and dad or mom slips away to go do something while the rest of the family is having a picnic or something. And so I thought that would be really fun to be able to bring my friend Chris into that. And so she, because she married poorly and chose a CIA officer, finds herself in a bad situation in Moscow.
Chris, what was that like? What was that like reading those pages when you were in the Mitch Rapp universe?
I'm just going to say I about lost my mind. I couldn't believe it. And I don't know if you guys know the backstory, or if you're interested, if I should share it here, or how that came to be. 2 years ago, when I was at the book signing with Kyle and with Don, so Kyle's last Mitch Rapp book, and Don was there with
Code. This is Code Red.
Yep, with Code Red, and Don was there with his last Jack Ryan book, Weapons
Grade. Yeah,
I can't remember now. Weapons Grade. It's right there.
Yeah, nice shelf back there, Chris. You are stocked and loaded back there on books.
It's right there. This is a sign here for everyone. It says "Free Chris."
Free Chris.
They held that up at the, not to cut you off, Chris, keep telling your story, but as I'm giving my talk in DC, John and Bridget hold up this sign that says Free Chris.
Yes. That's awesome.
Love it.
And I had just met them in person. It's just so, I mean, just amazing people at that signing. So such nice people. But so 2 years ago when I was at the signing, you know, I'm of course a Scott Coleman fan, and Sherry was there. So that was the signing that Sherry flew into Minnesota and came with. So, so I'm standing there and he's signing, and I said, you know, if Scott Coleman ever gets a girlfriend, it would be super cool if her name was Chris with a K. And he just laughed and laughed. And I just thought, oh, this is not going to go anywhere. And then he said, like, well, aren't you an Army family? Wouldn't that be kind of weird? Because Scott Coleman's a SEAL, right? So are you sure you could do that? And I said, oh, I'm pretty sure that would be okay to use my name for that. And it just goes along, and another year and a half goes by. And I get this message. He's like, well, I don't have a girlfriend for Scott in this book, but if you don't mind, I could use your name for another character. And I'm just like, oh, okay, sure. You know, throw me in. I'll just be in there somewhere. Oh, and what's your husband's name too? I'll use him. And I go, oh, intriguing. Didn't ask anymore. Didn't tell a soul. I did not tell my husband. I did not tell you guys. I didn't tell anyone, because I was just like, okay, we'll see. This is really cool. And then I read it, and I'm like, even my husband is reading it. He's like, you are a character in the book. You are all over in this book. It's just, it was so cool. And the ending, I have to tell you, no spoilers. My character's final scene, I will say, it's not the ending of anything. It's just that my character's final scene was ridiculous. It was so
almost as good as being Scott Coleman's girlfriend. Is that what you're saying?
Almost. What does Barry think about being Scott Coleman's girlfriend now?
It's right up there. But I was just, it was so cool. It was so cool. And my husband finished the book, and he was just like, can you believe that happened? Can you believe that you did that? You know that in there?
Don, you've got groupies.
So cool. Like, you are so cool. And I know. I'm really cool.
You've got groupies. What's it like with the fan engagement? You're on tour now. So like people like Chris and Sherry, she mentioned, another one of our listeners, they are over the moon in love with Rapp, and by extension in love with Kyle and you. And what's it like having this fan base? Is it a little overbearing at times?
No, I think it's pretty awesome, because it is, I geek out about this stuff as much as everybody else does. And so I never got to meet Vince, but I've gotten to know him through his family and friends and stuff like that. And so it's, I don't know, I think he would kind of get a kick out of it. And so I think, you know, these fans, and he obviously did that with people that meant something to him or were fans or were, I can't remember if his brother Dan was telling me this or Tim or one of them, that he would literally go around to his hometown folks and say, who hasn't been in a book yet? Who have I not put in? And he would find some way. And and Kyle famously talked about, and I think it might have been Anna or something like that. Her last name was Riley. And he had thought that Vince was dyslexic and spelled it wrong, and it was actually correct. It was somebody's name, and Vince had spelled it the strange way they did. So it's really, really fun to do, and just put people in Vince's world who love the books as much as I do.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. It's so cool. Yeah. And I think just from the fans that I interact with too, just online or in person, or that I meet throughout time at the signings, just incredible people that just really are so into it and just know so many details about the books and the stories. And it's awesome.
Yeah.
I love it. I just love Yeah.
I think there was a chance at the end of, or the transition, right, with the Survivor, and I think Kyle Mills being the torchbearer, being the custodian, the caretaker of Vince's vision, and actually having a few pages to go off of a scene that opened the Survivor. I just remember feeling in such good hands when he was chosen, and Capture or Kill did that for me as well. I don't want to go back in time, but again, reading that book, there was so much what's next, what's going to happen, what does this mean long term, and after that one, I was like, wow. It almost is like reliving when Kyle Mills wrote The Survivor. I just felt that great about it, and I know the fandom would unite around what you're doing, and so thank you. It's good to know Mitch Rapp does live, and Mitch Rapp is coming back. Where though, and when did you know not only that you were going to get the job, but that your vision was to go back in time? Like, because you very easily could have continued with what Kyle Mills left us with Code Red, an older Rapp, an aging Rapp, a family man. After 40, 50 years, he finally gets the family he's always wanted, but had to put away. So how did you have your vision to go back in time to this time period? When did that start or come to you?
Well, and even your first book also went back in time too. So
right, exactly.
Yeah, so I think for Capture or Kill, it was more. I started thinking that Kyle had done a fantastic job, and I said all the time, like, he could have just treaded water. He could have just put out another book that was the continuing adventures of Mitch Rapp, right? And he didn't. He made the universe richer and broader and deeper, and he made Mitch all of those things too. But I thought, like, as I was sitting down to write Capture or Kill, that what I didn't, that every writer that comes after Vince is one more step away from Vince. And what I didn't want was for my Mitch to somehow be diluted if it was only based on Kyle's Mitch. And so I went back and just started reading Vince's books over and over and over and over again, and and as I read them on my Kindle, even though I have paper copies of most of them, because it's really easy just to highlight things that are interesting or little nuggets that Vince throws out there, or even like some of them, they're pretty big deal. Like a guy is half dead and has been tortured and locked up, and you don't ever know what happens to him. We just go on to the next book. And so as I started reading those and making notes and trying to just, because I knew Kyle talks about, and I don't think it was 3 pages. I think Vince sent him 3 sentences, or that there were 3 sentences of that, because Kyle deliberately took those 3 sentences and put them throughout the book and wanted to see if anybody could figure what they were. And so he, with the Survivor, he made a conscious effort to do what he called a forgery, that he would try and write like Vince. And if you look at Kyle's a super, super organized guy, to the point where he has Excel spreadsheets that tell him how many times he used a certain curse word and how many times Vince used a certain curse word, or how things like to that level. And I knew that I did not have the ability to write like Vince any more than I had the ability to write like Tom Clancy. And my editor for my books, my Matt Drake books and the Clancy, when I got the Clancy gig, he told me, he's like, do not try and write like Tom Clancy. He said, what I want you to do is basically write fan fiction in the Tom Clancy universe. And he said, do what you do, but do it with his characters. And so as I was reading them, what I was hoping, knowing that I couldn't write like Vince, is that maybe I could instinctively make some of the same choices that he would make, or that when I thought about Mitch, I would be thinking about Mitch the way that he thought about Mitch. And so, like, as just trying to immerse myself into that one, just so that I could go back to the source, if you will, even though at the time I was still thinking that I would continue on with where Kyle left off. And as I was doing it, I kept coming back to that period of time between the Pursuit of Honor and The Last Man, that he had left to go back and write American Assassin and Kill Shot. And I was like, I wonder what happened during that time period. And then I realized that it was the Bin Laden raid, and thought, man, that would be a cool book. And so by the same token, you know, having been a fan first, way, way before I even had any published novels, like everybody else, I wanted to know what happened, not just what happened to Greta, but what happened to a very young Mitch Rapp who's still figuring things out, is incredibly good, but just doesn't have the experience yet that the Mitch Rapp we meet in Transfer of Power does. What happened to that guy, and what happened? And so when I had talked to Kyle about it, I was like, did you ever think about going back and finish it? I didn't know if it was kind of like holy ground where they didn't want anybody to go back and finish that trilogy because Vince never got a chance. And he said that he had kind of talked about it with Emily at one point and never pressed really hard. And Emily has a great poker face. You know, when I was pitching to her the idea I had for Capture or Kill, we were doing it on Zoom, and she was working from home that day. And I want to say she was even like walking around her kitchen, and I'd never met her in person, and I'm looking at her face, and I'm like, she hates this idea. And not only does she hate this idea, she hates me, and I'm going to get fired after this. They're going to go back to Kyle and be like, can you write another one? And so when I got done, she just stopped whatever she was doing and looked in the camera, and she's like, that's a great idea. You should write it. And then went back to, and so I think, and I only say that to think, I wonder if some of that, when Kyle brought up the idea of finishing it, wasn't that Emily was ambivalent about the idea. It's just that, you know, they never really talked it through. And so Kyle never did it. And I thought, I'd like to know that story. And I'm a super fan long before I was an author. I imagine other people would like to know that story too. And so I talked to Emily about it, and one of my biggest concerns is I feel like I didn't not lobby hard enough. That even sounds wrong. I don't think I did a good enough job with Capture or Kill, figuring out a way to make sure the fans knew where that book stood. And so where it stood in the Vince Flynn universe, even though obviously Bin Laden was in 2011, and you could certainly by power of deduction figure out where it is, there were a lot of people confused, and a lot of people were like, how is Mike Nash back now? What's going on with Stan Hurley? And so when I talked to Emily about it, I'm like, I want to finish this trilogy, and I want there to be no question about the fact that this is the third book. And so she had the idea of putting that cool little flash, sticker on the front that says American Assassin Thriller, that hopefully, now it doesn't cue everybody in, because I still got what is Stan Hurley doing here? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't help you at this point. But it was... That was kind of like people think I had, or maybe they give me too much credit, that I had this nefarious plan to go back in time and write these books. But it was really just an outgrowth of trying to go back to the source, to like immerse myself in Vince's world and Vince's Mitch Rapp, just so that I think when you asked before about the fans and the fans' response, I think one of the reasons fans are still so passionate about this series is that it hasn't, diluted has a negative connotation, and I don't mean that, but the Clancy universe has had so many different writers and so many different books and everything. I wouldn't say it's diluted. It's just gotten very, very big and there've been a lot of, it's kind of like if you're a Star Wars fan, right? Like you can go to war with somebody about which movies are good or not, and what George Lucas did with the original three, where he had his wife that helped with the writing of the scripts, and she brought this emotional component that weren't in the inlet. And so I think like you can have some of those arguments with the Clancy books, just because there were a lot of different cooks in the kitchen and a lot of different stories told, and a lot of different, even though I still think they did a phenomenal job making that universe bigger, I think the fans look at the Vince Flynn universe and it's much tighter. There's only been now 2 writers besides Vince. There aren't spin-off series in it. There aren't any of those things, which like I said, I'm not saying that's bad that they're in the Clancy universe, but I think it makes the Flynn universe feel much more compact, even though there's 25 books there, and fans have, I guess maybe another to look at is, I don't think I could name all the different Clancy books, because there've been so many and there's so many different writers. I don't know that every fan could name every Mitch Rapp book, but I think most folks could say, here's the 25, Vince wrote this many, Kyle wrote 9 after that, here's his first, because maybe the universe feels more manageable than some of the other ones do. And I think the fans respond to that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And me and Mike were talking about it when your first book came out, and it's you kind of like reference on it, but it almost feels like I understand why you wouldn't want to, like you said, dilute yourself. Like you want to give yourself the option to, sort of one, put your stake on it, but then also like truly, you are taking over for this is Vince's baby, so I don't know. I like the choice of what you did.
I appreciate that. I think the other way I looked at it too is that for Capture or Kill specifically, because I was sliding it in between those two books, I almost had Vince as like my training wheels. It's like, hey, I can put this book in here as long as I can figure out a way that tells the story, but then still leaves the universe unchanged after that. I've got Vince on either side of me, and so I'm not really breaking new ground, even though I'm telling a new story. And so that was kind of another thought. And this one was sort of like that too, even though I think there was more of a gap of story, certainly after Kill Shot, because there were so many years and such a big change in character, right? From Mitch Rapp of Kill Shot to Mitch Rapp of Transfer of Power.
Yeah. Transfer of Power, he's already talking about getting out of the game,
getting out.
Some of the early scenes. That's the first time he's ever written. Yeah. And then there's the ever elusive topic of where is he during term limits as a real deep cut for fans. So that's, more room in the sandbox to play around with one day, hopefully for yourself or wherever the series goes.
Yeah.
The other thing about continuing in the present day timeline, different series age characters very differently. Mm-hmm. We've talked with so many different people. Brad Thor has a take on it. Kyle Mills had a take on it. The Clancyverse has a take on it. You go to the children, the grandchildren, and you make this multi-generational.
Yeah.
The way you were saying about the tightness of the rap verse, I don't know who takes that bold step. Is that a decision that Emily Bessler should be involved in? Lisa and the Flynn estate should be involved in? Because that'd be a big step to say either a post-rap era or a rap as the older Stan Hurley type, or even any of the kids. Tommy Kennedy's out there somewhere in the universe. Rory Nash is out there in the universe.
Yeah,
it could be an open book, but do we want it to be an open book? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I don't know who could confirm this besides Vince himself, or maybe Emily. I've never asked Emily directly about it, but I get the sense that, and I can't remember if Kyle and I talked about it, maybe we did, that I get the sense of that Vince was trying that out in the first book where Mike Nash made his appearance, right? Because there was so much of it that was from Mike's perspective and so much devoted to his character and his family life and his kids, how to do it. And my sense is that at the time, the fans, not that they didn't like that book, but they wanted Mitch Rapp. They didn't want a spinoff of Mitch Rapp. They don't want, back then, obviously. Maybe that's not the case now. Maybe, folks all the time, some of the people, like what you guys said, some of the people that have read this book said, man, wouldn't it be awesome if we saw Thomas Stanfield more of his early years, whether it was World War II or thing, or same with Stan Hurley or something as well. But whenever you do that, there's trade-offs for it, right? Because you're making the universe bigger. It's got more branches and sequels in it, and you're probably not, unless they bring in another writer, kind of like what they do for the Clancy, then you're not going to have a Mitch Rapp book that year, right? You're going to have one or the other and stuff. And I think still, to me, the whole series, or the whole crux of the series, is Mitch Rapp, but it's Mitch Rapp because he is such a unique character, and he was the first protagonist that was post 9/11 who was, hey, we're going to go hunt our enemies down and shoot them in the face, and we're going to go on their home turf to do it. And he really gave voice to this nation that had just been grievously harmed and could not believe that September 11th could happen. And here's this guy who said, hey, I got this. And not just that, but that Mitch Rapp does bad things to bad people, but those bad things do not corrupt him as a person, right? They don't alter his compass. He doesn't. Lots of crime fiction, I think, becomes a study in the devolution of human beings, right? Like how whether you look at like Breaking Bad or something, it's kind of becomes like, how awful can a person become in a quest to do X, Y, or Z, right? I think you could make the argument that the Mitch Rapp series has a lot of awful things that certainly you or I or normal human beings wouldn't want to do, but it never causes Mitch Rapp to not be who he is. You don't have to worry that he is going to, turn into somebody that starts wantonly committing murder, or that it corrupts him, or that it does it. And I think that from, again, getting to know more of Vince through his family and stuff, I think Vince believed in that. I think Vince believed in good and evil as not abstract concepts, as things that existed. I think he believed in the nobility of our country, and that we are that bright city, shining on a hilltop, that all of those things that we talk about, that we use words for patriotism of God and country and stuff, those I think are all things that Vince held dearly and believed in. And you can see that in this character that is a lot different than other characters. Sometimes even in this genre, even though, all of us who write after Vince, certainly my Matt Drake books were influenced by the Mitch Rapp books that I lived. I think all of us that write after him have taken something from that, but that he put that line in the sand and said, Mitch Rapp is not going to become, some, contract killer or something like that, whatever it is. This is who he is, and he represents the best of us. And even though he has to do really bad things, he's still always going to represent the best of us. And I think that's very unique.
Yeah, no, that's you said it perfectly. Speaking of Matt Drake, are we gonna can you say any word about where Matt Drake stands right now?
So after my fourth book, which was Forgotten War, my publisher asked me to write a standalone, because what happens, he said, the books are selling, but I would love to have them sell better. And when you write a standalone, it's the opportunity for the publisher to treat you as a debut author again. And so most of the time in traditional publishing, you get the most money, the most advertising, the most whatever when it's your very first book, because you don't have a sales record yet. And so you're this whole blank canvas. And so a standalone is very much like that, because it's another book where they can market it as something different, especially if you're writing something that's adjacent but in the same universe. And so I'm about halfway done with that standalone, but I've been putting it aside. I can do about a project in a quarter or a project and a half. And so the first project is always Mitch Rapp. And then in the afternoons, or if I've gotten my word count down for that week, I might spend Saturday working on my side project. And so recently my side project has been the pilot episode for a TV series that would be based on Without Sanction. And so about a year ago, we signed a deal with a Hollywood studio, and they brought in a couple of writers to look at the book and look at adapting it for a pilot. And so both of them passed, and I found I was constantly trying to explain, like, this is what makes the books unique. This is what makes the story unique. This is how it's different from what's out there now. And so after the second or third writer passed, I said, hey, how about if I write the pilot? And not expecting them to say, yeah, that'd be a great idea. Why don't you do that? And so after I got off the phone from him, I called up my good buddy Chris Hottie, who was a screenplay writer for a living. And I said, hey, so how about you help me figure out how to write a pilot? And so he was kind enough to send some resources my way, and then provided notes for the first, I think, 2 versions of the pilot that I went through. And so I sent in the first version of the pilot in, I think it was the end of July. And then they came back. We got together about 2 weeks ago, and the producers really, really liked it and said, hey, here are a couple notes that I want you to go back and do another rewrite for. So I did that about 2 weeks ago, and one of them is on location filming somewhere else now, but I got an email actually yesterday saying, hey, when he gets back, we'll circle back. And so still a long shot. Like, Hollywood is kind of where we as thriller writers all go to die, because that siren song is so beguiling. Sure. And so it's very easy to forget what your day job is and chase that. But I don't know. It's been kind of fun. It's still a long shot, but we're getting closer. So That would be
That's
super
exciting.
cool. Yeah. We'll see.
Very cool. Yeah, I do enjoy when we get a good old donbentley.com newsletter email update, because we also get the Mitch Rapp ones from you. And it is nice to hear a little bit about Matt Drake and what's going on every once in a while. So
yeah, for sure.
Thanks for the peek behind the curtain. It's very clear to all of us that you were the right person for the job to take over the Mitch Rapp universe. I said it before, in Don we trust. And you've given us no reason not to trust you in the first 2 books and whatever comes next. Looking forward to it, and beyond with Matt Drake as well. We're looking forward to that. Everything you write, we're going to cover on the podcast because we're such big fans, and our audience loves it. They love talking Matt Drake, and Capture or Kill got a lot of buzz on the social channels. So thank you for doing what you do. Thanks for spending this time with us, and Mitch Rapp lives thanks to you.
Absolutely. I got my Mitch Rapp lives shirt on and everything too. So
there we go.
There you go. Thanks, Don.
Yeah.
Thanks, Don.